Hello, everyone. Today we'll be resuming reading, but today I'll be reading longer, to compensate for the cutoff I did on the previous video and the amount of time that's going on between these videos. So I'll be reading more today so that you guys have more to listen to. So, without further ado, let's get on with The Grand Escape. A lunatic who had escaped from an insane asylum. This was the role Gray wanted Kennard to play on their journey to the border. He could rant and blubber, tear his hair out, convulse on the ground, talk in tongues, or stay mute and wild-eyed, wherever he pleased. Never would he need to speak intelligible German, nor would he be expected to answer questions. Gray and Blaine would be the attendants, escorting him back to the asylum. At last Gray had revealed his plan, and from his answers to Blaine and Kennard's questions, it was clear he had thought it all through. What insane asylum? That was There was an institution in the town of Vechta, roughly 45 miles east of the Dutch border. It was north of the most direct route to the Netherlands, but the extra miles were worthy of the ruse. What if they were stopped by the police or other officials? Gray would act as a senior attendant, making any explanations in German. If they were pushed too far, or if Blaine was asked to speak, Kennard would provide a perfect distraction. He could stage an episode, wrestle against the restraints, shaking and foaming at the mouth. His attendees would need to control him, perhaps even force a tranquilizer, aspirin, but who would be any the wiser, into his mouth. Locals would want to get rid of him quickly. How would they explain traveling by foot and not by train? Kennard was too dangerous to be trusted around civilians. It would also explain the rumpled, dirty state of their clothes. After all, the lunatic had been on the run. Gray and Blaine had tracked him down, and ever since they'd been returning on foot. What would they wear exactly? According to what Gray had learned from his inquiries, patients at Vechta wore simple gray shirts and pants with peaked caps. As attendants, he and Blaine would wear plain civilian suits. All was easily crafted at Holzheim. Try as they might, Blaine and Kennard could not poke any holes in the plan, as all the disguises had shown their fellow escapee artists to use. It was by far the most original. Gray would be Fields Volge, a senior attendant at Vechta Asylum. Blaine, Karl Holzmann, junior attendant. Kennard, Kurt Grew, the lunatic. Kennard took the name of the German interpreter who assisted Gray in gathering all the information he needed to pull off the ruse. Satisfied with the plan, the three started to prepare the clothes and passes they would need. As an escapee, Kennard would not need papers. Gray and Blaine made identity cards with their names of the aliases. The papers stamped and signed with the name of Vechta's chief of police, Gunther. They had the official letter, also signed by Gunther, explaining the name of their business. We hereby certificate that the two guards, Karl Holzmann and Frank Vogel, chief guard, have the job of transporting the lunatic Kurt Rue to the asylum at Vechta. The above lunatic is forbidden to travel by rail or any public transport, and may not meet other people. All policemen and officials are requested to give all possible help in transporting this lunatic to his destination. The others in the breakout team banded up in twos and threes and gathered what they could in supplies. One officer's escape kit, stored in the host of hiding places about the barracks, was typical. 1 compass, 1 map, 1 Tommy cooker, 1 Dixie cup, 9 hard-boiled eggs, 5 pounds of chocolate, 8 sausages in skins, 2 tins of OXO cubes, 1 tin of chocolate powder, 1 tin of tea tablets, 1 tin of saccharin, 1.5 pounds of dried fruit, 16 ration biscuits, shaving tackle, soap, mending materials, 2 pairs of spare socks, 1 bottle of water, 1 piece of bitong, dried meat, 1 steel saw. Others also had cigarettes, flashlights, German marks, rope, brandy cherries, oats, silk, underwear, and other comforts for what threatened to be a long, hard trail. The men tested their homemade waterproof rucksacks by floating them in a large tin bath. Bone dry, one teller declared after the test. Rathborne intended to go by train, a respectable businessman on a cross-country journey. He had little to prepare, 2 civilian suits and a leather satchel that held some food, a razor, soap, a towel and hairbrush, and a hand mirror. To top off his look, he purchased a felt hat accented by a feather, in true German style, he explained, and borrowed some spectacles from a roommate. Cash completed his stack of maps, and the tunnelers poured over every line and marker, scouting the route they would take to the border to avoid the manhunt that was sure to follow. The tunnelers were not alone in their hopes and dreams, though. Summer escape fever hit Holzheim just as the weather turned warm. On June 6th, 3 prisoners hid inside a rubbish cart that was due to be collected and brought out of the camp. They were caught before it reached the gate. Days later, 2 die-hard breakout fiends, Timothy Brin and Cuthbert Southlight, made their own attempt. In more glamorous fashion, Sufkit, whose nickname was Fluffy, often took the female roles in the camp's plays. He'd grown his hair past his shoulders, ostensibly to play better the parts, but he had ulterior motives. Hair curled, cheeks rosed, and dressed up like a girl typist, Sufkit broke through the barricade and Block A into the Kommandur. Breen followed, dressed in a pristine German officer's uniform. As they headed out into the barracks entrance, Breen acted like he was dictating notes to his typist, and Sufkit shayed out of the gate, attracting nothing more than admiring gazes of the guards. However, Breen was recognized as a British officer, and the 2 were snatched up. None of the prisoners had informed Rathborne, the senior officer, about their plans, and their attempts caused fear to stab at the tunnelers that another search or punishment order would stall, or worse, uncover their own efforts, particularly since rumors about a sap still persisted. Anticipating a search, they kept constant watch for any movements around the camp that were out of the ordinary. Compounding this anxiety, Neymar had the whole camp riled up over his treatment of Captain William Liffey Robinson, an RFC pilot who destroyed a German Zeppelin on a bombing raid over England, carrying its 16 German crew members, but undoubtedly saving many British lives. Since Robinson came to Holzheim in midday 1918, Neymar had made his mission to break him. He had rarely seen the outside of a solitary cell, and when he did, Neymar forced him daily from his bed at bayonet point, inflicted additional roll calls on him, restricted his movements, demeaned him in front of the camp's visitors, and whipped him in private. Neymar's treatment of Robinson had every British officer spoiling for a fight. With these incidents and the burden of leading the tunnel project at its most critical hour, Gray was uncharacteristically on edge when one day he found himself confronted by an irksome German attendant in the parcel room. Something about his tone or look or the way he mishandled packages set Gray off. 2 exchanged words and the attendant grabbed the British pilot. The level-headed reaction would have been to submit particular at such a critical time as this. But Gray had had enough. He threw himself to the floor and refused to budge. Shouts of alarm brought a host of German guards. Perhaps to shield his embarrassment of being unable to manage the situation, the attendant accused Gray of brandishing a large knife that had remained on the table throughout the short scuffle. Gray was hauled down to a solitary cell, and Neymar had sent him to hand over for a court-martial. For once, the scales of justice tipped in favor of a British prisoner, and Gray received only 2 weeks of solitary imprisonment for simple disobedience. Though Captain Hugh Donfield, a fellow Anglo-Indian officer who spoke Hindi and occupied a room in Block B right above his cell window, Gray was kept appraised on the tunnel's progress and relayed messages to the team. He urged Blaine Kennard to launch the escape once the sap reached the rows of rye, even if he was not yet free himself. They could not risk a delay. On one of the walls in Gray's cell was scribbled over the line, "Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage." He languished in the cellar, looking at those words, the tunnel approaching its most critical hour. Chapter 15. Jim Bennett, an RNAS observer, and his 2 shift mates crept from their rooms in Block B and climbed the stairs to the attic floor. Another officer accompanied them to unscrew the door handle plate, let them through, then refasten the plate so the padlock and chain looked secure if a guard came by. The 3 men removed the panel in the unused attic room that gave access to the eaves, hurried down the slope space, exited on the orderly side. At the bottom of the stairs, they slipped through the narrow hidden door in the panel. A half hour later, Bennett reached the face of the sap, the 26-year-old from Somerset, England, come from a family of farmers. He had been hunting for U-boats in the North Sea when his plane had a mechanical issue and crash-landed on the rolling waters. Bennett and his pilot were captured by a crew of a German submarine. In the almost year since, he had attempted to escape several camps before being sent to Holzheim. There, he was reunited with his pilot, Peter Campbell Martin, who had already been in on the tunnel scheme. Bennett proved a tireless worker. Now that their new method of entry proved round-the-clock access, the tunnelers really did need every minute. The last lap of their dig had proved to be the most difficult. This was not only because of the distance from the entrance to the end of the tunnel, but also because they hit another layer of stones as they began gradually angle the tunnel up towards the surface. After a long stint prying those stones loose from the hard clay, Bernard shimmied his way downward to the start of the tunnel to change places with one of his shiftmates. Several hours later, the three heaved their sacks over their shoulders and climbed up the stairs. With the tunnel chamber packed from floor to ceiling with sacks of dirt and stone, they now had to carry out their excavated debris. They scattered the contents of the sack about the eaves, then returned to their rooms. The finish seemed close enough to taste. On June 30th, the team figured out that the tunnel needed to extend to the rye field at last. By a length of parcel string, it measured almost 60 yards. Infantry Lieutenant Walter Basil Butler volunteered to pinpoint the tunnel's exact position. He scrabbled through the wall while others from the team watched from the fourth-floor window in Block B. For most of its distance, the tunnel ran 9 feet underground, but the incline at the end brought it to within 5 feet of the surface. Butler had with him a long, rigid wire with a white cloth tied to the end. When he reached the face of the tunnel, he would push the wire point up through the earth. The team scanned the field for any flash of cloth. If a guard outside spotted a dirty white flag suddenly emerge from the ground, they and the tunnel would be done for. After what seemed a lifetime, the cloth finally emerged. As Kennard described it, it nosed its way up through the earth like some strange new plant. Then it quickly disappeared underground again. The site, a full 8 yards short of the field of rye, and completely exposed in a wide open field, left the entire team crushed. They had no choice then to keep digging. The rye field was further than they predicted, and the rise and falls, twists and turns of the tunnel had thrown off their measurements as well. Any day, the tall stalks of rye might be harvested and their cover lost. Despite desperate, they worked shift after shift with a frenzy that left them exhausted and rattled. Not only did they have to excavate another 24 feet of dirt, they also had to cut off an offshoot chamber to house the dirt that would be brought down on the night they dug to the surface. On one July day followed the next. The layer of compacted stones continued to dog their efforts, and they had only advanced a few yards. They were simply not making the progress they needed. Gray's 2 weeks of suffering the heat in small confines of solitary complete. He emerged from the cellar more resolved than ever to escape, and they held a late-night meeting in the barracks to bring him fully up to date. They still had another 6 yards to go to reach the rye field, and the jeopardy to their plan of the approaching harvest was too great. The end of the sap was almost within the 6 rows of green beans that had been planted in front of the rye. Though they were only 2 feet high and were in the range of the camp's arc lights, their dense bushy leaves would go some way to concealing the emergence of escapees from the tunnel. They crawled low enough, and by now all the officers were expert in that, they could get to the tall rye and away. After some debate, the men voted to revise their exit point. It was their only option. In mid-July, as the sappers approached the bean rows, Namor unwittingly helped them with their preparations by lifting the band on parole walks. It was an odd sensation walking easily out of Holzmine when they'd been laboring so hard underground. On one walk, their guard even allowed them to wade into the river, wester to cool off in the hot summer sun. Some of the tunnelers pushed deep into the water to find an easiest crossing point. The other restrictions were also lifted, and after a month of not being allowed any theater, the prisoners were permitted to stage a Rouve, Home John, in Block B dining hall. Some of the actors wore tuxes and evening dresses, and one, playing a statue of William Shakespeare, was in a white robe and stood on top of a box engraved with the great dramaticist's name. Even David Gray played a small role. It was almost as if he had no plans in escaping in a few days' time. Officers crowded in every available space to watch, and Namor sent interpreters to make sure no criticisms were being made on the German Reich. During the intermission, a newly arrived prisoner turned to a fellow next to him and asked indiscreetly, within earshot of the interpreters, "Are you in on the tunnel?" The very utterance of the word sent a shockwave through the surrounding men, some who were indeed on the scheme. The interpreters gave no sign of having heard, nor did anyone dare respond, but it was proof that the existence of the tunnel was common knowledge. There were whispers about it all through the camp. Prisoners who were unaware of the nature of the plan knew there was an escape in the offing. One recent arrival, who was pushing to be part of whatever the plan might be, wrote in his diary, expecting something big to come off any night now. The whole camp is getting kind of anxious. Some rival schemists aim to get ahead of the tunnel group. Knowing that it would result in a crackdown, Rathbone made it his mission to deter these attempts. Soon after the Rouvre, he got wind of a scheme in Block A. Several officers intended short-circuiting the camp's lights at night. In the confusion that followed, a decoy would be hung in the windows on one side of the barracks to look like if someone was climbing down to the yard, while the escapees cut the wire fence on the opposite side and dashed away. It was a clever idea, for Rathbone instructed its ringleader, called him Livewire, to put a stop to it. Livewire resisted. Rathbone made it clear that the tunnel had been in the works for almost 9 months, and that as senior British officer he was forbidding all their attempts until it had gone ahead. Livewire reluctantly agreed, but asked to be part of the breakout. Be part of the breakout. Impossible, Rathbone said. Over the past several months, any tunnelers occupying rooms in Block A had gradually won transfers to Block B. At this late stage, any request to be moved might raise suspicions in the commentator. Rathbone won the argument again, or so he thought. July 21st, the tunnelers scraped away their last horizontal length of dirt and stone. By their measurements, their shaft reached beyond the first 2 rows of beams. The rectangular offshoot chamber that would store their upright diggings would also be complete. At a meeting in the barracks that afternoon, the tunnelers decided that 0 hour would be the following night after lockup. Gray led the meeting. He wanted an orderly breakout. Nothing could be left to chance. Any unnecessary bustle in the corridors of Block B, whether on the officer's side or on that of the orderlies, might be noticed by a guard. He wanted no logjams in the eaves, in the stairwell chamber, or worst of all, the tunnel itself. The men would be on edge already, and he did not want a stampede or a scuffle to erupt, nor any panic within the sap. Every man must know his place in the line and when he was ready to move. There had to be a buffer of time to allow for any delays or hiccups along the way. The first escape party would be the 13 officers who made up the team assembled after the departure of Cockhorn and the Pink Toes, with Blaine as a late arrival. Once this baker's dozen was clear, the rest of the team would start to move. First off would be Rathbone, then Bennett and Campbell Martin, followed by John Boosford and Lyon, and finally John Toothless, Steve Purvis, and Leggott. There were also others to consider. The Ruck. The team drew up a list of other officers who had contributed in some way to the escape. The more important their contribution, the higher on the list their name appeared. Outside these individuals, each tunneler was allowed to nominate an officer they trusted to be included in the attempt. In total, there were 60 men on the list, almost 10% of the total camp population. To maintain the secrecy, the men in the Ruck would only be informed that the escape was in progress after lockup. Those willing to attempt an escape would be instructed to ready what kits they could and await the signal to go. Allowing the tunnelers a head start, the Ruck would begin to move an hour after the last of the core team was out of the sap. The others were asked if they wanted to use the tunnel to escape themselves, but they were not willing to trade holes in the mine for a coal or salt mine, which would surely be their punishment as if they were caught. It would be reward enough to know that they helped the tunnelers escape and Neymar look like a fool. 2 officers volunteered to oversee the camp operation. Captain Durnford, Rathbone's adjutant, and a friend of David Gray, was selected to manage the list. He would be responsible for alerting each officer when it was time to go. Lieutenant Louis Swaggy Grieve would serve as a doorman on the attic floor. Nobody would get past the short, barrel-chested Australian without his permission. Not least because he was well loved by the whole camp for his Sydney cheer. On the other side of the eaves, 4 orderlies would take control. 1 to oversee flow out of the eaves, 1 to lead each officer down the stairwell, 2 in the chamber itself, sending men to the tunnel. Their plan in place, the men concluded that their meeting and went out to the Spielplatz for what they hoped would be one of their last roll calls in Holzheim. The next night, the tunnelers ate the heartiest meals they could assemble, got dressed for their journey, and inspected their rucksacks one last time before chitching them closed. All had their journeys to the border planned. They waited for the guard, who always made one last check of the corridors and rooms at night to finish and leave the barracks. Suddenly, Livewire, the ringleader of Block A escape plot, was discovered hiding in Block B. He had heard that the breakout was scheduled to come off and planned to be a part of it. This could not be allowed to happen. First, Livewire was not on the list. Secondly, if it was discovered that he was missing from his own barracks during a final check of night, an alarm would be raised. Rathbone took control of the situation, ordering Livewire to go directly to a guard on duty and tell him he had mistakenly stayed in Block B after a lockup. He could say that he had lost track of time, that he had fallen asleep, wherever he decided, but he had to go. Defeated, Livewire left to take his medicine, to be on the safe side. The tunnelers postponed 0 hour for the following night. Chapter 16. Tonight! All through Tuesday, July 23rd, the tunnelers whispered this to one another, rose from their beds, and herded on the Spielplatz for morning roll call. Tonight! Drinking tea, eating stale biscuits for breakfast, waiting in line for one last parcel or letter. Tonight! Shuffling about the yard, watching a game of football, a tasteless lunch. Tonight! Reading in their rooms, checking their kits again, playing poker, another roll call. Tonight! Another circle of the yard, a stretch of the legs, a pot of coffee. Tonight! The evening roll call, a final hug from Neymar, murky brown soup for dinner. Yes, tonight. At 6 p.m., Gray assembled the team in the barracks. Their long captivity was almost over. They were anxious, knowing well the perils that lay ahead. They would go tonight. He confirmed everybody who was ready to be after lockup. The halls and rooms were swept of any officer who did not belong in Block B. Lookouts would be posted at the entrance to ensure that neither Livewire nor other interlopers tried to come inside. There could not be another postponement. The town was left to prepare, and Gray sat down with Dunford. The two men were of similar age and experience and shared a particular style, well-trimmed mustache and a stiff look. A decorated officer of the Royal Field Artillery, Dunford had been captured in the Ypres Salient after being lost amid the ruined, featureless landscape in August of 1917. He had known about the tunnel for months, but thought it was nothing but a fool's errand, sure to be discovered. But now that it was finished, he regretted not being on the list, but he swore to do everything he could to see it come off smoothly. The sky darkened, the clouds swept quickly across the rising moon. A storm was blowing in. Gray waited with Blaine and Kennard in his room, where they passed the time until lockup, examining their maps again, making sure they knew exactly where they would go in the first few hours of their run to Holland. Blaine turned his cigarette lighter over and over in his hand. He had prematurely inscribed it with the words, Holzheim, escaped July 22nd, the previous night's date. Kennard practiced his madman act. He wandered about the room, rolling his eyes, jabbering incoherently, blowing spit bubbles, and whimpering like a wounded animal. Oh, shut up and listen for a minute! Gray interrupted at one point, drawing his attention back to the maps. Not even the father of the tunnel was immune to the tension of the night. Through Block B, officers were nervously waiting. They ate what food they could stomach and smoked cigarettes. Some drank wine to bolster their courage. Others declined, believing alcohol would dull their senses and reflexes when they needed them most. Jim Bennett was one of those who stayed sober. In his mind, he played out the journey through the tunnel. Then he swam across the Wester. Once on the opposite side, he would navigate quickly and quietly through the surrounding fields of corn and rye, eluding any pursuers. Rathborn stood at the barracks hallway, checking with the lookout at the door, and that there been no more surprise visits from Livewire. He confirmed that there was no interlopers inside the barracks. Rathborn then dropped by Dunford's room to say goodbye. When he put his feathered cap and glasses to show off his disguise, Dunford praised his look as wonderfully Teutonic. Then he wished him good luck. Blaine and Kennard returned to their own bunks shortly before 9 p.m. They had put on their escape outfits with their pajamas over them. The pajamas would keep their clothes clean while they were crawling through the tunnel. At the turn of the hour, the door of Block B was shut and locked on the inside by the lone guard. No matter how long the officers had been prisoners, that resonating clang never lost its impact. 1 hour more to wait. They kept an ear out for footsteps of guards. If they heard him coming into any of the rooms, the tunnelers knew to jump into bed and throw their blankets up over their clothes. The minutes ticked away. The winds continued to gust, and the occasional flash of lightning lit up the sky. Rain had yet to fall, but it would start before long. If they managed to break out, they would be soaked to the skin before they reached the river. At 10 p.m., as it was his routine, the guard finished his last check and exited the building. Locking the door behind him, 15 minutes later, Gray informed Dunford that it was all clear. Time to go. Dunford made his way through the corridors, alerting those in the ruck that the escape was going ahead and that each man should be ready when his time comes. Some tried to cajole, bribe him to know their place on the list, but Dunford was incorruptible. Boots in hand, all the better to keep quiet. The kit bags looped over their shoulders, the core members of the tunnelers crept out of their rooms together. They climbed the stairs to the attic. The handle of the swing door was removed. They entered the attic floor. They assembled one more time in the room with a hidden panel. There was no need for speeches, nor final instructions. They were all prepared for what lay ahead. They wished each other well. Good luck. Godspeed. Then Butler, the first on the list, disappeared into the eaves. Outside, the storm howled, as one officer described it. Thunder cracked and boomed like a finale of a gigantic opera. They could not have asked for better weather to sneak out into the night. A religious man, Butler muttered a short prayer before pushing his kit back into the tunnel and following it in. He had crawled his way through the sap scores of times, but had never felt so important as now. One of the best and fastest sappers on the team, the others were depending on him like never before. His burrowing up to the surface could not be detected by the guards. Otherwise, 9 months of labor and heartache would have been for nothing. Worse still, it might result in some of them being shot. Kit in one hand, candle in the other, he squirmed through the tunnel. The first stretch, with its downward slope, was easy going. He knew every turn, dip, hollow, and rise by heart. He knew when to duck his head, when to worm sideways to avoid a protruding stone. He continued to pray as he went. At the tunnel's end, he put his kit aside. His sweat soaked his hair and collar. Without taking a break, he started digging straight upward. The trail made it easy work of the soft dirt and clay, which poured down on top of him, coating his hair, sticking to his eyes and ears, trickling down his neck. He paid no mind to the discomfort. The sooner he got to the surface, the more time he would have to get away. What was more, any delay meant fewer officers in the ruck would be able to escape as well. Within a half hour, he reached the surface and took his first breath of fresh air. Fresh, free air. Rain pelted down, and light from the camp arc lights looked unnaturally bright. His hole was only 6 inches in diameter, but it was a start. He dug faster than he could kneel. He dug faster now that he could kneel in the tunnel and extended his arm. Faster, too, no doubt, because freedom was in reach. The next 2 officers on the list, Andrew Colston and William Langdon, joined him after half an hour. As planned, the 2 of them packed the earth piling up around Butler into an offshoot chamber. By 11:40, the hole was wide enough to climb through to the surface. First, Butler pushed his kit up and out of the tunnel onto the field. Then he used his arms and feet to brace the sides of the 6-foot-deep hole. He slowly rose. His hair was soaked, and rain mixed with dirt poured down his grimy face. As he eased his head over ground, he was pleased to discover that the exit came out beyond the first 2 rows of beams. He climbed up into the field and crawled on his belly to where the plants started. Hiding amid the dense leaves, he searched for the guards stationed outside the prison wall. The arc lamps and shadows they cast made it hard to see. For all they knew, the guard might be standing still, eyes fixed on the tunnel exit, because he had spotted some kind of movement there. Then the guard coughed, and Butler saw, at last, against the darkness of the wall, he was pacing to and fro, obviously unconcerned and unalarmed. In that moment, the rain halted, the clouds overhead gave way, and the moonlight shone down on the field. Minutes before the rain stopped, Private Ernest Colston, an Army Service Corps driver, and one of his orderlies, had been staring at the bean rows from the first window at Block B's orderly quarters. For over half an hour, he had searched through the darkness for any sign of Butler. He should have cut through the surface by now. Perhaps Colston thought he had missed him because of the lights and shearing rain. He might have already be in the rye field and on his way to the Wester. He had no knowledge of knowing for sure, and Gray and his team needed to know definitely that Butler had made it out before they proceeded into the tunnels themselves. They were depending on Colston to tell them. Gradually the moon broke through the clouds. There, amid the bean ruins, Colston spied a hunched figure. In the next moment, the man crawled towards the stalks of rye, followed soon after by 2 others. Colston hurried from his observation post to the stairwell. In his socks, he barely made a sound. Once up to the attic floor, he clambered through the small door, quickly crossed the eaves, and knocked out the panel into the officers' quarters. Reeve pulled it aside. Butler made it, Colston said. Little else was needed. The next batch of tunnelers, including Blaine, Kennard, and Gray, filed into the eaves. Colston followed them back into the orderly quarters. When he offered to lead them down to the cellars, Kennard said, "Don't bother, Colston. We'll see ourselves out." Chapter 17. "Chalk's away," Blaine said, tossing his kit ahead of him into the hole. But the bravado had maintained throughout the evening quickly dissipated as he crawled in after it. Kennard followed, then Gray. Those who had gone before had left a few tin can lamps burning along the path, but had given passage many kinks and turns. The 3 crawled mostly in pitch darkness. They did not want to waste time by holding candles. Blaine kept up a good pace, pushing his rucksack ahead of him. He wriggled a few inches on his elbows, pushing the rucksack. Wriggled, pushed, when his jacket caught on a rock, or when he slowed to take a breath, he felt Kennard's back push up against his feet. During one stretch, which was lit by candlelight, Blaine suddenly found himself staring straight into the face of a rat. Its eyes were like black beads. He had seen so many rodents while working the tunnel, but the sight still sent a shiver down his spine. Before he could brush it away, the rat disappeared into the darkness, its senses no doubt alive to an exit ahead. The tunnel had never felt so long nor looked so ominous. Blaine found himself panting for a breath, and his arms grew heavy from pushing his kit ahead of him. The shadows cast about the narrow, misshapen bore resembled monsters awaiting attack. He wanted nothing more than to be free of it. Then he saw a light up ahead, shining down into the tunnel. He panicked. The Germans must have found the sap's exit. They were lost. He would have scrambled away had there been anywhere to go. Instead, he lay flat and motionless as a stone. "What's up?" Kennard said, his voice a little more than a muffled mutter. His claustrophobia was making him more anxious than ever. Blaine angled his head to the side, his eyes adjusting enough to see that the light was simply the glare of the arc lamps through the hole. But now he found himself stuck. Gray added his muffled demand to know what the problem was. Kennard thumped the back of Blaine's boots. Finally, the young pilot wrenched free and moved ahead again, his heart beating like a drum in his chest. After a couple more feet of crawling, he reached the tunnel exit and breathed a cold draft of fresh air. He rose to his knees, then to his feet. In what he figured might as well be his vertical grave. With only the encouragement from Kennard and Gray kept him moving. He eased his kit out onto the field, then squirmed himself upward. His head rose out of the tunnel. He fully expected to hear the cracks of a gunshot. When he was only met with a patter of raindrops, Blaine finally caught his breath and calmed down. 60 yards away, Holzbein was cast in ghostly white pallor by the arc lamps swinging in the wind. The guards paced back and forth by the wall, his rifle tucked under his arm, his coat collar tight around his neck. The wind blew from the southwest, stealing away any sound Blaine might make. Taking care anyway, he eased himself slowly up onto the field. He kept his body low as he scrambled through the rows of beams. Then he stopped and looked back towards the tunnel exit. Kennard, then Gray, and then the others behind them emerged in close succession. It looked like their heads and feet were connected, as they resembled a huge, mud-splattered crocodile. Blaine almost laughed at the spectacle. At last he reached the rye field, some of the fallen stalks rustling loudly underfoot. Afraid that the guard might hear the racket, he waited at the edge of the field for Gray and Kennard to catch up. In whispers they debated advancing into the rye versus crawling along the field until they were far enough. Taking charge, Gray decided to go through the stalks. It was the quickest way, and he was sure that the rainfall would deafen the noise. They crunched their way into the field. Blaine convinced the guard would hear them, and cries of alarm were bound to follow, no doubt with dogs soon after. When nothing happened, he relaxed enough to straighten up from his crouched walk and speed up. After the rye field, they came to the main road they had ran between Holzheim and Auschwitz, the nearest town to the northwest. They knew from their German accomplices that during the night the police patrolled this stretch of road on bicycles, and they were sure to wait until they were confident that the coast was clear. Then Gray led them northward through more fields of rye and corn to the top of a low hill. There they dropped their rucksacks on the ground and took a brief rest. In the distance, the town of Holzheim seemed to float in a sea of darkness. At last, they were able to savor their freedom. They were masters of their own fate again. The air never tasted fresher, the hunk of Carly's marching chocolate never sweeter. Bet Namar wouldn't be sleeping so well if he knew we were here, Blaine said. Let's hope nothing disturbs his slumbers until morning, Kennard replied. Just let's make sure, Gray said. We never see that bastard again. They let the thought linger. Then they trampled down the hill to the west. Wesser. The river served as a natural barrier to any escape westward. Bridges over it were patrolled, and its vast deep waters had delayed or altogether foiled earlier escape bids. They needed to cross it on the opposite bank before first light of dawn, at roughly 4:30 a.m. Otherwise they were sure to be recaptured. Charles Rathbone thrust his body into the tunnel, the fit almost as tight as a cork being pushed into the bottle. The Artie Stowe officer had made stouter by two suits he wore, one to get dirty, to be thrown away, his other the disguise, a German civilian on a cross-country train journey. He'd only been down in the sap once before and never gone through its full length. He was quite unaccustomed to the claustrophobic environment, and the effort it took to crawl through. The fact that his face was almost level with the dirt floor only deepened his discomfort. Nonetheless, he kept pushing himself forward, grunting and sweating as he went. Jim Bennett was behind him, like a racehorse behind a mule. There was no way around the senior officer, nor can he do anything about the walls and roof of the tunnel being disturbed by Rathbone's movement. Rathbone was not the first to disturb that already shaky structural integrity of the tunnel. What with their kits and their eagerness to escape, the officers of the first group at 13 had gone before had knocked out struts, loosened rocks, and left chunks of dirt, as well as tins of food fallen from their rucksacks, along the path. Once the ruck arrived, the state of the tunnel would surely deteriorate further. After an hour in the tunnel, Rathbone finally squirmed free, stretched out into the beams as he was certain to hear the sentry breathing. Bennett rose from the sap behind him, followed by a fellow airman, Peter Campbell Martin. They wished each other well, then Rathbone wiggled on his belly into the rye stalks. Once deep inside the field, he lifted up his hands and knees and continued as a crawl. Beyond the rye field was one of corn. Such was the denseness of its narrow rows that he almost felt trapped by the crop. At last he broke free. He crossed the cabbage field, then brazenly hiked along the road that left him south from Holzheimer, while the others were heading west in the direction of Neymar. In the direction Neymar would immediately suspect and send his guards, Rathbone decided to go the opposite way. He planned to catch a train, the first of several, in Gutenhagen, 35 miles to the southeast. Bennett and Campbell Martin threaded 300 yards through the same rye and cornfields as Rathbone, albeit traveling much more quickly in the opposite direction. They may have been moving in the direction Neymar would suspect, but they would tend to do so much at a pace that nobody would catch up with them. In Block B, Durnford was making his rounds, peeking into rooms, whispering to members of the Ruck where they could start their escape now that the core members of the tunnels were out. At 12:45 p.m., he knocked on the door of Major Jack Morrow of the Royal Irish Regiment, number 22 on the list. "Your turn, Major, and God bless you," Durnford said. Morrow thanked him and rushed up the 2 flights of stairs to the attic. In the attic room, Grieve told him that he would have to wait a bit longer. Someone was stuck in the tunnel. Morrow hunkered down beside the dorm-room window, listening to the gale and intermittent rain. Now and again, he looked out the window to watch the German guards on their rounds. Little did this one station outside the wall know that there were men several feet beneath him. "All clear," an orderly announced from the eaves. Grieve allowed Morrow and several officers to pass. They crept along the length of the barracks, through the eaves, down the stairs, and into the chamber. After shaking hands with a fellow Irishman, Corporal McKay, Morrow entered the tunnel. It was the first time he had ever been in it. Following a quick descent of the initial slope, he found himself in pitch black. The tightness did not surprise him as much as the roar of sound. The long snake of men ahead of him, their heavy breathing, wriggling bodies, clanging kit bags, and curses made for an almighty din. The guards above the ground must be able to hear them for sure. He inches forward, wrestling past broken struts and piles of dirt and stone. The tunnel was in a sorrowful shape, just as he began to gather some kind of rhythm, using his grip on his rucksack to pull himself forward. He felt that he hit a wall. Then the wall started to back itself up on him. The man in front of him was attempting to reverse. Morrow tried to shout at him, but with his face inches from the damp earth, his voice came out muffled, stuck, and panicking. The man in front thrashed about, kicking his legs and twisting back and forth. Meanwhile, the officer behind Morrow pushed at his heels. Crushed between the two, Morrow was terrified. At last, the man ahead jerked himself free and moved on, and Morrow was able to start crawling again. He was tired, desperate for fresh air, and harried by the continuous noise. He managed only a few feet before he encountered a large stone blocking his path. The officer in front of him must have dislodged it in his panic. Using his rucksack, Morrow shoved the stone a few inches forward, hoping to find a place in the tunnel wall where it would lick and loose. If it had fallen from the roof, there would be no hope. Bracing his legs, he thrust against the stone, then again. He was damaging the sides of the tunnel, but he had no choice. Feeling with his hands, he found the place where the rock had come off the wall. With a last shove, he returned it to its place. The tunnel was disintegrating with the ruck's every movement. Morrow feared he might never find his way out. Chapter 18. David Gray scanned the river for the narrowest point to cross. The storm had roiled the black waters, and the distance to the opposite shore looked like an ocean. Kennard was scouting the banks and spotted a dilapidated fence bordering a nearby field. He had an idea and started breaking off slats. Bound together, the wood could serve as a raft for their clothes and rucksacks. By the time he and Blaine had gathered enough wood, Gray had found a point to begin their swim. They would still be 150 yards across to the other bank. They stripped down to their underwear, bound up their clothes, and put everything on a rope-together fence slat. Their watches read 2:15 a.m. before they went into their rucksacks. The men were already soaked through by the rain when they slipped into the intrepid water. The shifting clouds overhead cast the river alternately into darkness and moonlight. Fearing a patrol, they waited for it to be dark before pushing away from the bank. They swam furiously to the other side. each holding onto a side of the raft to keep it steady. Waves swept over their heads and the movements of the trees on the opposite shore. They could tell that the currents were dragging them swiftly downstream. On they went, kicking their legs and swinging their arms. Halfway across, they were already heavily breathing, their limbs weary. A white cap almost pitched over the raft, but they managed to keep it afloat. Desperation and nothing else drove them to reach the western shore. At last, they climbed up onto the bank and collapsed with relief. After recovering a little, they emptied the raft. The wind and rain chilled them to the bone as they put their damp clothes back on. Kennard dragged the raft a few hundred yards up the bank to throw off the German bloodhounds that were sure to follow their trail. Gray suggested they march as far north as possible, believing that the search area would be concentrated on the forest west of the Weser. Blaine and Kennard agreed. At first they followed the road beside the river. Though it ran a serpentine course, Gray figured the extra distance on the road would be covered far faster than trampling the more direct line north through the forest and muck-mirrored fields. Gray and Blaine both carried heavy rucksacks containing their food stores, and other key supplies. Kennard carried only their spare kit with extra clothing, tobacco, and chocolate in it. If they encountered any Germans, he would have to ditch it quickly before they saw. A madman on the run would not be expected to have prepared a bag. They shed their pajamas outside the town of Heisen and hid them in some reeds. The filthy clothes had done their job on keeping their outfits underneath clean. The small village of Poli and Brevely were empty as they walked down the main streets. A dog barked at their presence, but otherwise they passed through unnoticed. Dawn approaching, they walked a little further before veering off the road into some thick woods to hide during the daylight hours. They were roughly 9 miles from Holzheim, and 9 miles would have to be enough. They ate a light meal, a tin of ham and some black bread, and smoked cigarettes. Blaine got a good chuckle out of one of the other two when he told them how they and their fellow officers looked like a huge crocodile streaming out of the tunnel. He volunteered to take the first watch. Exhausted, Gray and Kennard agreed and went quickly to sleep. Blaine stared out into the surrounding darkness of the woods and wondered how his fellow breakout artists were faring. There was trouble in the tunnel. Lieutenant Edgar Garland, a pilot from New Zealand, was halfway through when the man in front of him stopped moving. Garland rattled his boot, but the officer did not react. Perhaps he had fainted. Garland had a flashlight, but its narrow beam did not penetrate far into the twisting burrow. "What's the idea?" he shouted. "Having a rest?" "The tunnel has fallen in, and they're trying to clear it," the man in front called back. "It would only take a few minutes." Garland rested his head down in the dirt and tried to calm his breathing. The air was bad from all the men down in the hole. If there was a block, it was sure to get worse. Moments later, he felt someone jamming up against his feet. The chain of officers behind him had caught up. "What's wrong?" a voice at his feet gasped. Gerhard explained, confident that the block would have loosened and still make it home run to Holland. He was too confident. The sap had caved in completely, several feet shy of the exit. 29 officers had made it through, including Jack Morrow, but now the dirt and stone had cascaded down the slope and rendered it impassable. Morrow Marcus Hartigan, a 30-year-old veteran of Boer War, was next in line to break out, only just managed to scramble backward before being buried alive. Try as he did to reopen the face to the hole with his hands, there was too much dirt blocking the path. If they were to survive, then the men behind him, all of them, needed to abandon their escape and crawl back out of the tunnel before the oxygen ran out. Back at the sap's midway point, Gray waited 15 minutes and half an hour. Nobody was moving, and from the gargling sound echoing through the sap, the men were starving for oxygen. With his own arms weakening, he was sure he was in the same boat. Now and again he flicked on his flashlight for some relief in the inky darkness. Thoughts of dying came to him. He almost lost hope when the officer behind him said that he was heading back. Garland followed, hauling his rucksack behind him. Time and again the retreat halted. The men were sapped of strength, and their coats and kits kept snagging on rocks. At last, Kennard reached the slope that ran back up to the tunnel's entrance. He might as well have tried to climb a cliff backwards. Then someone grabbed his leg and pulled him out. Alerted to the cave-in, Dunford and Griffith had organized a chain of men to haul out bodies. Their first concern was to get everybody out alive. The second was to do so before 6 a.m. An hour fast approaching, when a guard would unlock the doors and send the orderlies out on their duties. If they failed to clear the sap, and if men were still moving about the orderlies' quarters, they risked the breakout being discovered long before the morning roll call at 9 a.m. Those 3 hours could prove the difference between escape or recapture for those who made it out. Some in the ruck had fainted or were too weak to excavate the tunnel on their own. Gurn volunteered to help drag them out. With great effort and at risk of falling victim to another collapse, he crawled deep into the tunnel again and managed to muscle one of the officers after another back through the hole. Shortly after 6 a.m., he had helped out all but Major Hartigan and the officer behind him. He remained in the chamber with a few others while the orderlies and officers sneaked back to their rooms and removed any signs of the nighttime activity. Dunford watched from the windows for any hint that the breakout had been discovered, but the guards continued to walk in their normal rounds. They might yet make it to the first roll call without any alarm. And half hour later, they had succeeded in extracting Hartigan and the other officer. Neither were in great shape, but they were still breathing. While they recovered, Garland and the others crept backward up the stairwell, across the eaves and into their own quarters. Soon after, Hartigan and the other officer came straight out of the orderly's door to the block B. They would have returned to their rooms through the attic, as the others had done before, but they were too aided and oxygen-starved to think clearly. As they crossed the cookhouse, they were seized by guards. Officers were not allowed onto the parade ground before 7 a.m., and so were not officers exiting the order's quarters in muddy clothes. Minutes later, Namor stormed up and demanded to know what they were doing. Cooley not yet divined the reason. Neither answered. The standoffs were interrupted by someone hammering on the eastern gate. A red-faced, coolly incensed farmer explained that a parade of men had stamped about his fields, ruining his crops. Namor and his guards followed the farmer out of the gate and found a hole between the rows of beans. "So a tunnel!" Namor explained. He turned to one of his lieutenants, a man called Maldebrat, and ordered him to find out how many had escaped. While Maldebrat headed for the barracks, Namor ordered another guard to climb down into the tunnel. The guard eyed the gaping hole and his commandant, then shook his head. "There might still be officers in the sap," he said. Next, Namor tried to send down his dog, but the animal barked at the order too. Namor strode off to the Commodore. He rang the local police, the town garrison commander, and finally General Hunchnick in Hanover. A manhunt needed to be launched, no effort to be spared. Maldebrat had never cared much for Commandant Namor and his constant distribution, and as he went about the corridors counting the men, he could barely suppress a thin smile as silence met his calling out the names of officer after officer. Murmurs of excitement followed him around the barracks. "The tunnel has gone, boys," one officer crowded to his roommates. A ground escape had indeed come off, and the only question was how many had managed to get away. Maldebrat finished his count and went to join Namor in his field. "Nien un zwan zing, Herr Captain." "Nu un zwan zing, Captain." Duin watched from the window for a reaction to the number he already knew. He described the moment. Namor's jaw dropped. His mustachios for a brief instant lost their twirl. His solid stomach swelled less impressively against his overcoat. Just for a moment, he became gray and looked very old. But only for a moment. Then the Commandant went beet red. He cursed and kicked the ground and shook his fist at the officers watching him from the windows, ordering his guards to shoot at anyone who appeared at the glass. Several shots were fired, but used to Namor's rages, the officers who were in the crosshairs had already dived to the floor. Throughout the barracks, the officers repeated the number like it had been some kind of hallowed meaning. 29! 29! It was the greatest breakout of the war, the greatest, perhaps, in the history of warfare. That is to Chapter 19. Thank you all for listening, and thank you all for actually staying and giving me hope. Hope you guys have a great day, and let's get that outro music playing. Alright. Thank you all for listening, and hopefully you all have a great day, great night, or whenever you're listening to this. Hope you all stay safe, and bye-bye.